You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello and welcome to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Naseem Ahmed and I will be your host for today's conversation. I am really thrilled and honored to have our guest today, Professor Michael Lynk. And today we will be discussing his last report, which is submitted to the United Nations Human Rights Council in April. Professor Lynk, as many of you know, is Professor of International Law. He served as the UN Special Rapporteur from 2016 until his term ended just in April after 6 years. And he teaches at the Faculty of Law, Western University, London, Ontario, Canada. As I said, I'm really thrilled to have you with us, Professor Lynk, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. Thank you for joining us.
It's a great delight to be here once again. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, so before we go into the discussion about your report, I mean, how are you feeling generally since your term ended after 6 years as a special rapporteur? How are you feeling? How are you doing with your time now? How's it been?
Well, the irony is I'm probably busier than ever as a result of my report in terms of either interviews I'm giving or meetings I'm attending. While I'm very proud of all the reports that I wrote, the 12 reports that I wrote while I was Special Rapporteur, the attention given to my 12th and last report on apartheid is probably more than my first 11 reports combined. There's been a number of requests for interviews, for participation on panels, for attendance at meetings, and I'm pleased that that my report is a part of this growing conversation among the international human rights community as to how to properly understand what is going on in the occupied Palestinian territory. I of course am not the first to say that apartheid winds up existing. That's been said by a number of well-researched, well-presented reports over the last 2 years. But it's one of the first, not the first, but one of the first reports that has concluded that there's apartheid coming from within the United Nations.
Yes, I mean, I think you've given a number of interviews and I hosted you in another session as well. And as you said, demand for interviews with you has generally been really high. And before we speak about the report, I want to ask you more generally about the occupation itself. In your report, you mentioned that in Israel, there is a legal oxymoron where occupation has become a perpetuity. So, and I think previously you also spoke about, occupation, Israeli occupation specifically being an illegal occupation, because many in the international, well, not many, Western leaders assume that the occupation is legal. It's not illegal, let alone, they won't admit the fact that it's apartheid, but they will continue to maintain, the notion that it's a legal occupation and still see the Israeli occupation, the situation in Palestine through the lens of occupation. But you've previously argued that, no, we should really look at the Israeli occupation slightly differently. It's an oxymoron, it's illegal. So unpack that for us before we go into your report itself, which looks into that as well.
Sure. In an earlier report that I had issued in October 2017, I came to the conclusion after looking at what the principles of what we call international humanitarian law, which is basically the law of war, which includes the laws of occupation. Occupations are meant to be temporary. They're meant to be short-term. The occupying power is forbidden to annex any of the occupied territory. And the occupying power as well has to rule in the best interests of the protected people, who are the people under occupation. And finally, they have to administer the occupation in good faith, which means in full compliance with international law and in full compliance with any and all UN resolutions with respect to this. So those are the four key principles that govern any occupation, whether it be Russia in Ukraine, whether it be Morocco in Western Sahara, whether it be the Israelis, Israel in the Palestinian territory. Israel has breached each of those four guiding principles. Its occupation is obviously no longer temporary or short-term. Generally, the rule of thumb is that an occupation should last between 5 to 10 years at the maximum. You think of the American occupation of Japan after the Second World War, or the Allied occupation of Western Germany after the Second World War, or even the Americans and their coalition allies in Iraq after 2003. Those all ended within 8 to 10 years. Here we have a 55-year-old occupation that is no sign of ending, and where the occupying power is annexed territory illegally, where they are governing in the best interest of their own sovereign claim as opposed to the interest of the Palestinians under occupation, and where it has violated a number of features of the Fourth Geneva Convention and of UN resolutions. So all that taken together, I had come to the conclusion, 4.5 years ago now, that this occupation had crossed the bright red line into illegality. And there's a hope. One of the things I called for was whether or not the United Nations General Assembly should seek an advisory opinion to the International Court of Justice as to whether or not the occupation had become illegal. The world agrees that there are aspects of the occupation that are solely that are illegal, such as the annexation of East Jerusalem, such as the settlements. But there's been no judicial pronouncement that the occupation itself is illegal, given its 5.5 decade-long duration. So that's what I'm hoping will wind up happening with respect to this.
And of course, with your report, you've gone one step further and joined a number of other human rights groups to declare Israel accuse Israel of practicing apartheid.
Yeah.
You also mentioned in your report, when facts change, so must our minds. So what are the facts in your mind that changed in the 6-year period to make you to make that determination?
Sure. When I became Special Rapporteur 6 years ago, I had decided in my mind that I wasn't going to touch the issue of apartheid. To me, it just seemed like a bridge too far to try to persuade decision makers, both legal and diplomatic, that they had to start imposing accountability on Israel to bring this occupation to an end. I thought, when I first became Special Rapporteur, that using the framework of what we call international humanitarian law and international human rights law, that would be sufficient to compel the international community to hold Israel to account and demand that it end the occupation. And I began to realize 3 or 4 years into my mandate that most of the world agreed that the Fourth Geneva Convention applied, and that Israel was in breach of these precepts of humanitarian law and human rights law, but nothing was changing. There was no sense that the international community was going to hold Israel accountable with respect to this. And as well, to me, I began to realize, as writing report after report and reading what the civil society from Israel, from Palestine, and the international human rights movement was saying, that this occupation was becoming more entrenched, it was becoming thickened, and that Israel was now no longer even having a pretense that they're going to allow a genuine Palestinian state to emerge. Albert Camus once wrote, "Calling things by the wrong name adds to the affliction of the world." And as I was looking at this in a deeper way, I was beginning to realize that this occupation was becoming indistinguishable from apartheid. When you have two separate and distinct political and legal systems governing two different groups of people in the same geographic and political unit, when you have separate highways for two separate people, when you have laws that that permit self-determination for one of these peoples and denies it to another, when you have marriage laws that forbids Palestinians in Israel from marrying Palestinians in the occupied territory and living together as a family, where it wouldn't have any where there's no restrictions on a Jew from Israel being able to marry an Israeli Jew from an Israeli settlement, you begin to realize that this walks like apartheid, it talks like apartheid. Then you have to do a serious investigation as to whether or not it is actually apartheid. So those, if you like, are in sum, are the reasons what led me to begin to explore this question and to devote my last report on the question of apartheid.
Yeah, let's dig deeper into this a little bit. You mentioned some of the Israeli apartheid laws, like Jewish-only roads, the marriage laws. But as we know, apartheid is clearly defined in the Rome Statute. So what are some of the features and characteristics which, in your mind, proves that Israel's behavior has moved into a threshold where we can clearly define it as being a country practicing the crime of apartheid? It's a legal definition. So, you're a lawyer. I mean, you're an expert on international law. So, what is it that you do in proving your case that
Sure.
apartheid is a crime that's being practiced by Israel?
Sure. Well, what I did is I turned to what the international law says on what is apartheid. And in doing this, I was following in the same footsteps that Palestinian organizations like Al-Mizan or Al-Haq, and Israeli organizations like Yashtin and B'Tselem, and international human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International had already done. And what they had done and what I did was to look at what the 1973 International Convention Against Apartheid and the 1998 Rome Statute on the International Criminal Court said on apartheid. Those are the two leading international instruments or documents which provide a detailed definition of apartheid. So what I did was, what other the organizations had done, was to look at these definitions, try to harmonize them, and come up with what I said was a three-part test for the existence of apartheid anywhere in the world at any time. The first part of the test is, does there exist an institutionalized regime of systematic racial oppression and discrimination of one group over another? The second thing I looked at was this institutionalized regime set up with the intention to maintain the domination of one racial, national, ethnic group over another? And the third step is, in the process of this intentional establishment of the systematic domination, were there inhumane acts that have been committed as a result of this structural discrimination? And on each of those three aspects, I concluded that they were satisfied. And if I can just very briefly tell you why.
Sure.
The first step is there an institutionalized regime of systematic racial discrimination and oppression? And I said yes. If you look at the 700,000 Israeli Jews who live as settlers in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, they live with the full benefits and rights and privileges of Israeli citizenship. They can vote for the government that, if you like, controls their lives. They are given extraordinary financial benefits and incentives to live in these settlements in occupied territory. They have the full protection of Israeli law with its guarantees of fair procedure, fair trials, fair evidence, and so on. They're an integrated part of a very wealthy society that I think in 2020, the GDP per capita of each Israeli was $44,000 US per Israeli. So with all of these political rights, legal rights, social rights, living in segregated communities designed to house only Israeli Jews, living on Palestinian land, the poorest Jewish settlement in the occupied territories has more rights and benefits and a better standard of living than the richest Palestinian community living in the occupied territory. So if you contrast that to the 2.7 million Palestinians who live in the occupied West Bank, or who live in the 360,000 Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem, they don't have the right to vote. They have no control over the government that dominates their particular lives. They're ruled in the West Bank by a Israeli military justice system that conducts trials in Hebrew, a language most Palestinians don't understand, in many cases on security issues, have no right to be able to see the evidence that's being gathered against them, or to be able to effectively cross-examine those who are alleging that they have committed these security offenses. They live their lives ruled by 1800 military orders. All of this together says that there is an extraordinary difference between the civil rights that Israeli Jews have living in these segregated Jewish-only settlements, and what the Palestinians who live in the same geographic and political unit live among them. So to me, that was the single clearest example of the persistence and existence of apartheid in the OPT.
And the third part of of the triangle of the system of the intention, motivation, is the violence, and the daily violence which is required to maintain and uphold and preserve the system of apartheid, as you say.
That's correct. I mean, if you have a system where there's been 55 years of alien rule over people who don't want to be ruled, they want their independence, they don't want to be under foreign alien domination, then the only way in which the alien power, the occupying power in this case, can maintain that is generally by increasing the levels of violence as the resistance against their rule continues to rise. 2021, for example, saw the greatest number of Palestinian deaths caused by Israel since 2014. 2021 saw the greatest number of settler attacks against Palestinians and their property since statistics began to be kept around 2012. We see a rising level of home demolitions. All of the factors are indicating that the violence that Israel needs to sustain this domination, this apartheid, continues to increase and shows no sign of abating, because the Palestinians show no sign of wanting to submit and to live passively under under foreign domination. Basically, what we've learned from the last 70 years of a decolonizing world is that an alien power has two choices. Either they end the fever dream of settler colonialism and enable the independence and the self-determination of the people they have previously ruled, or alternatively, they double down and increase the tools of military and judicial repression in order to sustain their particular rule. And by far, most colonial powers have taken the first step. Israel, by contrast, has taken the second step in order to keep a permanent control over the occupied territories, either by increasing the number of settlers who live in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, or by barricading the population, as they have with respect to the 2+ million Palestinians who live in Gaza.
So, I mean, anyone that follows your work and your position and mandate will know, I mean, you're focusing specifically on the occupied Palestinian territories. But is there scope now for your successor, Francesca Albanese, to take the framework of apartheid, which you eloquently and amazingly provide, and to look at Israel as a single entity, which is committing the crime of apartheid, not just simply within the occupied territories, but within the whole of what we call historic Palestine?
Yes. Look, that'll have to be a decision probably by the Human Rights Council as to whether or not they decide to expand the remit or the mandate of the Special Rapporteur for Human Rights with respect to Palestine, and expand that to include Israel itself. As you know, and as I alluded to earlier on in our conversation, several human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, Al-Haq, and
Amnesty
International, thank you, have looked at apartheid with respect to from the river to the sea. And they said it's impossible to be able to say there's democracy here and apartheid there, that the two systems are intimately intertwined with one another. And they've looked quite seriously at the status, the second or third class status of Palestinian citizens of Israel, where there are somewhere between 40 and 60 pieces of discriminatory legislation that restrict their full rights as Israeli citizens. And as Benjamin Netanyahu has said, along with a number of other Israeli politicians, Israel is a Jewish state. It is not a state of all its citizens, which thereby excludes the 21 or 22% of Israeli citizens who are Palestinian Arabs. So I read, and I think read with great understanding and been persuaded by reports that have been issued with respect to whether or not apartheid exists between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. I find them persuasive. As Special Rapporteur, my mandate is more limited, but I will point out that near this time last year, the United Nations Human Rights Council created a new commission of inquiry, which is to look into the root causes of the conflict between Israelis and Israelis, Jews, and Palestinian Arabs, and that may well include looking at issues like apartheid. But at the end of the day, the rising arguments made by Palestinian civil society that you can't look at the occupied territory in isolation of the rights of the Palestinians living as Israeli citizens, and you can't separate them from the millions of Palestinians who live in the diaspora. That one of the great successes of Israel's rule has been the splintering and the strategic fragmentation of the Palestinian population, and that defies most basics of international human rights law. So I think there's a call now to be able to take, if you like, a universal or global understanding of the situation of Palestinians that goes beyond simply the occupied Palestinian territories. And I hope this widening of the lens, of the analytical lens, will lead us closer and closer to a final just resolution for everybody involved.
Let's move on and look at some of the response and reaction, and also what is the next step now that we have a consensus amongst the human rights community. There is apartheid between River Jordan and Mediterranean Sea. Have you been surprised by the pushback? Your own government says it doesn't agree with the designation, but it's not offered any explanation as to why that's the case. Have you been surprised by the pushback against you, and also, the human rights community generally?
No, I haven't. I deeply regret it, but I'm alas not surprised by it. The arguments they've raised is it's not apartheid, but they give no detailed explanation as to why they disagree with either my report or with all of these other reports that have been issued recently, which tells me that that there's no depth to their opposition. There's no moral or legal or human rights core to their arguments. It's simply a brush up and saying it's not apartheid, when all of this, extraordinarily deep evidence has been gathered, not just by myself, but by these other organizations we've mentioned. If their brush off is it's not apartheid, without offering any comprehensive or detailed explanation as to why they disagree or which facts they think are wrong, tells me that these arguments are quite thin. The other two arguments I've heard is, and you can guess the first one is, well, it's anti-Semitic to say that Israel is a practicing apartheid. It is not. If the facts based on the accepted international legal standard for apartheid lead you to conclusion that through these separate communities, these separate rights, that Israel is practicing apartheid, at least in the occupied Palestinian territories or in a larger geographic sphere, then simply saying it's anti-Semitic to be able to say that has no moral core to its argument either. And the third argument, which I hear largely coming from European diplomatic centers, is it's not helpful to try to find a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by calling this apartheid. And that strikes me as probably the laziest of all of the arguments, because well, as I said from my quote from Albert Camus, you have to call something exactly as it is. And if the facts and the law lead you to a designation of apartheid, that elevates the level of the crime. Because under the Rome Statute, apartheid is a crime against humanity. It's among the most serious of crimes that could be committed in international criminal law. And therefore, that has to lead you to some conclusions. And what we see is a remarkable passivity, a remarkable reluctance by European and North American countries in particular to put any wedges in their political and diplomatic and economic relationship with Israel. Yes, they will from time to time criticize Israel for its actions. We certainly saw that with the death of the Palestinian journalist 2 weeks ago. Yes, they will on occasion vote for UN resolutions which are critical of Israel, but no accountability flows from that. And that's what I think why human rights organizations are so insistent upon putting forth this new analysis with respect to apartheid, because they want to be able to, I guess, up the ante in requiring Europe and North America in particular to impose accountability, to impose a meaningful cost on Israel, because criticism without consequences, particularly with respect to Israel and its 55-year-old occupation, becomes meaningless.
I mean, that question has always puzzled me. I mean, I think you've mentioned it a number of times as well in previous talks, how this conflict is the most well-documented conflict in modern history. We have more United Nations resolutions about it than any other conflict. And we also have many legal statements from the ICJ, for example. So there's no hiding from it. So when international governments, especially in the West, refuse to acknowledge the reality, I think some of it probably comes down to the fact that admitting imposes responsibility. If you admit Israel is an apartheid state, then of course you're burdened with the responsibility to do something about it. And I think there's a fear over having to do something after admitting that Israel is an apartheid state.
Exactly, with respect to that. And if I can just give you one anecdote, which I came across a couple of months ago. 10 years ago, there was an interview given by the then Norwegian foreign minister, Johan Støre, who was today actually the prime minister of Norway. At the time when he was Norwegian foreign minister in 2012, he was the chair of what is called the Ad Hoc Liaison Committee, which is the semi-formal organization of leading Western and Arab countries that provide aid to the Palestinian Authority. In other words, they take over the responsibility that ought to be Israel's to ensure that the Palestinian Authority has at least enough finances to keep its head above water. And he was interviewed by a particularly, I suppose, particularly leading Israeli journalist, Akiva Elder of Haaretz. And Akiva Elder asked Støre whether the international community's funding of the Palestinian Authority amidst Israel's deepening occupation was actually leading to a Palestinian state. And Støre replied in 2012, well, once it becomes clear to everyone that the donor's mechanism is perpetuating the status quo rather than leading to peace, we will have to reconsider. And we're not quite there yet. And I say to you 10 years later, I think the answer is self-evident. I put that to a leading Norwegian diplomat when I was in Oslo 2 months ago. And I gave that quote exactly to him, and he went on a meandering response, which concluded with, we're still not quite there yet. You know, what international diplomat who pays attention to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict cannot do their math that 300 settlements and 700,000 Israeli settlers, increasing by 20 to 25,000 settlers a year, is not leading to a Palestinian state. You know, for Israel, the fact that the international community continues to say we support a two-state solution and we don't want anything done to jeopardize that, this becomes Israel's sweet spot. Because Israel can continue to deepen its occupation. I mean, I think the moment for a Palestinian state has already vanished. And yet, as long as the international community keeps on believing or deceiving itself that a Palestinian state is possible under these conditions, then that gives the green light, that gives permission to Israel to continue to doing what it's doing. You know, there are voices in the international community in a candid moment who have acknowledged the reality. 9 years ago, John Kerry, who was then the US Secretary of State, said that the window for a two-state solution was only a year or 2 years away, and then it's all over. He said that in 2013. In Resolution 2334 in December 2016, the UN Security Council warned in its resolution that Israel's settlement activities were, I'm quoting, dangerously imperiling the viability of a two-state solution based on the 1967 lines. Ban Ki-moon wrote a great op-ed 11 months ago in June 2021, where he said that Israel has pursued a policy of incremental de facto annexation in the territories it has occupied since 1967 to the point where the prospect of a two-state solution has all but vanished. You know, these comments, these candid comments tend to be fleeting because they then go into another diplomatic black hole where there's amnesia about what is happening. So I guess I say what a special rapporteur with the OPT has to be is a truth teller. And I certainly took that from two of my predecessors, John Dugard and Richard Falk, and I know that my successor, Francesca Albanese, will also be a truth teller as well with respect to what is actually the dynamic reality that's going on the ground.
I've no doubt she will be. I mean, our half an hour has just flown by, to be honest. But I wanted to ask you one last question. It's part of a personal one. I mean, the position you undertook for the last 6 years is kind of a thankless task with the smears and the accusations that comes with it. So what's your best memory, and what are you most proud of in the 6 years that you were Special Rapporteur?
Sure, thank you for that kind of question. And I'm going to just modestly disagree with you in that, yes, look, there's criticism from particular sources that are directed at me. But you know, if the criticism was substantive and actually criticizing my facts or showing me that my analysis was wrong, well then, you know, I would accept it. But probably because the criticism is so banal, it is so static and repetitive, is that he's anti-Israel. I'm not anti-Israel. I'm anti-occupation. I'm pro international law. None of the criticism that was put to me changed any of my mind that, you know, what I was doing was acting in the true spirit of international human rights law. So in terms of the things, you know, that I'm most proud of, I think probably it's the two reports that you and I have discussed today. My report on illegal occupation, which in October 2017, and now my apartheid report in March 2022. The other thing that I'm proud of is authoring a statement that was issued in June 2020 with 67 of my fellow UN's human rights experts and independent experts signing on, opposing the pending de jure annexation, and for the first time using the possibility of apartheid would be existing. So the fact that I was able to accomplish those, I think, has left me most proud. And I have to say, you said this is a thankless job. I was told when I first took this job that one of the best parts of it are the people you meet and the friendships and relationships you develop with those in the international and regional human rights community. And that statement was absolutely accurate. I feel a much richer person and a much, I suppose, more accomplished legal professional for having done this particular work. I would, if I was asked to do this all over again, I would say yes in a heartbeat, because whatever abuse was thrown my way is far outweighed, I think, by the fact of being a truth teller and explaining the international human rights legal system as a means of understanding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
That's inspiring to hear. Professor Lynk, it's been an immense pleasure and honor to have you on MEMO Conversation. Thank you for joining us. And thank you who have tuned in to listen to MEMO Conversation with Professor Lynk. Hope to see you again soon. Have a good evening or good morning, wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for having me.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.